In 1901, a young woman named Annie Edson Taylor climbed inside a wooden barrel reinforced with iron bands and allowed herself to be thrown over Niagara Falls. She was 63 years old. The drop was more than 50 meters. Inside the barrel, there was almost no room to move, almost no air to breathe, and no guarantee that the structure would survive impact. Before the descent, a cat had been sent through the same route as a test. The animal survived. That was enough for Taylor to proceed. Imagine the noise from inside that barrel. Not the distant roar tourists hear from a safe railing, but a total invasion of sound so violent it erases thought. Water crashing like machinery, wood shaking under pressure, darkness, compression, the body receiving signals older than language. Danger, collapse, death. She survived. When journalists asked her later about the experience, she did not describe transcendence or triumph. She reportedly warned others never to attempt what she had done. Survival had not made the event pleasant. It had done something more important. It separated fear from destruction. That distinction changes everything. Most people assume courage is the absence of alarm, that the brave are somehow built differently, born with quieter nervous systems or a more obedient mind. But fear is not a moral flaw. It is machinery, ancient, fast, protective machinery designed to keep fragile organisms alive in uncertain environments. The problem begins when that machinery starts detecting threat where no real catastrophe exists. A conversation becomes a cliff edge. A rejection becomes social death. A mistake becomes annihilation. And without realizing it, a person can spend years living as if ordinary discomfort were a waterfall powerful enough to kill them. The strange question is not why humans feel fear. The real question is why the body keeps sounding an alarm long after reality has proven the threat is survivable. Fear is efficient. It does not wait for evidence. It does not hold a committee meeting inside your skull and calmly review probabilities. It reacts first, interprets later. That efficiency once kept humans alive. A rustle in tall grass could be wind, or it could be a predator. The organism that hesitated to gather more information often disappeared from the gene pool. Better to overreact and survive than underreact and become food. This logic still governs modern bodies. But the environment changed faster than biology. Now the threats are rarely teeth, venom, cliffs, or starvation. They are abstract, invisible, psychological, status loss, embarrassment, exclusion, uncertainty. And yet the body often reacts as if humiliation were physically lethal. Heart racing before sending a message. Sweaty palms before speaking honestly. A tightening chest before entering a room full of strangers. The body does not care that the danger is symbolic. It only detects deviation from safety. This is why avoidance feels intelligent in the moment. It offers immediate relief. You cancel the difficult conversation, and the pressure drops. You postpone the task, and anxiety softens. You stay silent, and discomfort recedes. Relief feels like proof, but relief can be deceptive. The nervous system is constantly learning from what you repeat, not from what you intend, not from what you understand intellectually, from what you do. And every time you retreat from harmless discomfort, the body records a conclusion. Good thing we escaped. That is how prisons are built without walls. Not all cages are visible. Some are constructed from 1,000 tiny acts of self-protection that feel reasonable, even wise, while slowly shrinking the boundaries of a life. The most dangerous fears are often not dramatic. They are ordinary enough to become routine. There is something deeply counterintuitive about how fear changes. Most people try to solve fear through negotiation. They wait to feel more confident, more prepared, more certain. They study, plan, rehearse, analyze, and mentally simulate outcomes as if clarity alone could convince the body to stop panicking. Sometimes knowledge helps. Often it doesn't. A person can fully understand that public speaking is not life-threatening and still feel their throat close before stepping onto a stage. A person can know a difficult conversation will probably be survivable and still avoid making the call for months. Insight is not always enough to update instinct. This is where the real conflict begins. between what you know and what your nervous system believes, because these are not always the same thing. The body is less persuaded by explanation than by repetition. It trusts evidence gathered through lived experience, not theories, not intentions, not promises made in moments of motivation. Experience. Repeated enough times, something remarkable begins to happen. Situations once coded as dangerous begin losing intensity. The alarm does not disappear instantly. It changes gradually, almost insultingly slowly, until one day the thing that once dominated your imagination feels strangely manageable. Not easy, manageable. What you are about to discover is not merely a strategy for becoming less anxious. It is a deeper principle about adaptation itself, about why discomfort can either become a prison or a teacher depending on how you relate to it, and why some of the strongest people are not fearless at all. They simply stopped treating alarm as authority. Here is the paradox. The sensations most people interpret as signs to stop are often the exact conditions required for recalibration. A racing heart is not always a warning. Tension is not always a verdict. Uncertainty is not always a threat. Sometimes these sensations are the nervous system standing at the border of outdated predictions, resisting an update. And this creates an unbearable contradiction. The path away from fear often begins by moving toward the very sensations you have spent years trying to eliminate. Not recklessly, not blindly, but deliberately. This feels unnatural. Every instinct argues against it. The body says retreat. Memory says be careful. Identity says this is not who you are. But what if those signals are not protecting you from danger? What if they are protecting an old map of reality that is no longer accurate? This possibility is unsettling, because it means many limits people defend as permanent may be learned responses mistaken for truth. Not destiny, training. And training can be reversed, but only at a price most people resist paying. Temporary discomfort. This is the cost. Not talent, not genetics, not extraordinary courage. Just repeated contact with what once triggered alarm, long enough for the body to gather new evidence. So the real question is no longer whether fear feels real. Of course it does. The more disturbing question is this: how much of your life has been organized around obeying alarms that were never designed to tell you who you are capable of becoming? In 1920, inside Johns Hopkins University, a psychological experiment was conducted that would become one of the most controversial studies in the history of behavioral science. Its subject was not a hardened adult volunteer or a trained research participant. It was an infant. His name was Douglas Merritt, though history remembers him by another label, Little Albert. He was approximately 9 months old when psychologist John B. Watson and graduate student Rosalie Rayner began observing him. At first, Albert displayed what many infants display naturally: curiosity. He was presented with various neutral objects and animals: a white laboratory rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, cotton wool, masks with hair, even burning newspapers. He showed no fear toward the rat. That detail matters. Fear did not emerge spontaneously. It had to be installed. This is what makes the study so disturbing. Watson was attempting to prove something radical for his era: that emotional reactions could be conditioned, shaped by environment rather than simply inherited or instinctive. In other words, fear might not only be something you are born with. It might be something you learn. A child reaching toward a harmless white rat does not yet carry symbolic meaning. There is no narrative. No catastrophic interpretation. No expectation of danger. Just contact. Neutrality. This is how many fears begin before language gets involved. Not as ideas, but as associations. An ordinary object. An ordinary situation. An ordinary experience. Still emotionally blank. Before the mind labels something as dangerous, something else must happen first. Connection must be forged. And once that connection exists, reality itself can begin to feel contaminated by a meaning that was never there in the first place. The mechanism was brutally simple. Each time Albert touched or approached the white rat, Watson struck a steel bar behind the child's head using a hammer. The sound was sudden, violent, and deeply unpleasant.
À loud métallique explosion.
Not enough to physically injure him, but more than enough to trigger distress. Albert cried. He flinched. His nervous system registered alarm. Again the rat appeared. Again the noise. Again distress. Repeated pairings. Nothing mystical. Nothing poetic. Just repetition. This is what makes conditioning so powerful and so unsettling. The brain does not need a real threat to create fear. It only needs consistency. A neutral stimulus paired often enough with discomfort begins to absorb emotional meaning. The rat had not changed. Its fur remained soft, its behavior harmless, but the child's experience had changed. And experience is what the nervous system trusts. After several pairings, something irreversible appeared to happen. Albert no longer needed the sound. When the white rat was presented by itself, he began to cry and withdraw.
No amer.
No steel bar.
No explosión.
Just the object. The fear response had detached from the original source and attached itself to something innocent. This is how the mind becomes economical. It stops waiting for the full pattern. It learns shortcuts. If this predicts danger, avoid it. This logic is adaptive in genuinely dangerous environments. But it becomes a trap when the association is false. Because from that moment on, the body no longer reacts to reality itself. It reacts to a learned prediction layered on top of reality. And once prediction takes control, harmless things can begin to feel threatening with extraordinary conviction. But the experiment did not stop there. What happened next was even more revealing. Albert's fear began to spread, not only to the white rat, but to other white and furry objects. A rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, cotton, a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. This phenomenon is known as generalization. The nervous system rarely limits itself to precise categories. Once it learns a pattern associated with danger, it expands outward. Better to over-include than underreact. This strategy is efficient for survival. It is disastrous for peace. One unpleasant social interaction can evolve into anxiety around all unfamiliar groups. One painful rejection can contaminate future intimacy. One humiliating mistake can infect every opportunity involving visibility. The original source becomes blurry. The emotional residue spreads. This is how a single experience can quietly colonize large regions of a person's life. Not because the world objectively became more dangerous, but because the nervous system became more predictive, more vigilant, more eager to detect possible repetitions of pain. The cost of this strategy is subtle. It does not usually look dramatic from the outside. Person simply avoids places, avoids conversations, avoids risks, avoids conditions that vaguely resemble the original discomfort. And because nothing catastrophic happens while avoiding, the strategy feels justified, safe, rational. But safety acquired through avoidance often carries hidden interest. You pay for short-term relief with long-term restriction. The nervous system concludes, our fear was correct. And the invisible territory of what feels dangerous continues expanding, one association at a time. There is an ethical shadow hanging over this experiment that cannot be ignored. Little Albert was conditioned to fear, but historical records suggest there was no documented attempt to fully remove the conditioned response before the study ended. The fear was created. Then the child left. This unresolved ending is one reason the study remains deeply controversial. Not only because it demonstrated how fear can be manufactured, but because it exposed something profoundly uncomfortable about human vulnerability. A mind does not need logic to become afraid. It needs pairing, repetition, association. This means many fears people defend as part of their personality may not be identity at all. They may be learned emotional architecture, installed slowly, reinforced quietly, protected automatically. Person says, I'm just not good with conflict. I've always been anxious in groups. I'm not built for risk. But beneath these declarations may lie something far less permanent than character. A conditioned response mistaken for self-knowledge. This is what makes fear so deceptive. It often feels ancient, personal, inseparable. As if it came with you. As if it reveals who you are. But sometimes what feels most natural was merely repeated enough times to become familiar. And familiarity can be confused with truth. That is the unsettling implication left behind by a crying child and a harmless white rat. If fear can be built this easily, then what most people call who I am may rest on foundations far less solid than they ever imagined. And what begins after that realization is far more destabilizing. If fear can be installed, then an unsettling possibility immediately appears. Can it be dismantled? Not suppressed. Not intellectually rationalized. Not buried under discipline, distraction, or performance. Actually changed. In 1924, psychologist Mary Cover Jones began working with a young child known as Little Peter. He was approximately 3 years old and displayed a strong fear reaction toward furry animals, particularly rabbits. Unlike ordinary dislike or hesitation, Peter's response was visible and immediate. He withdrew, cried, and resisted contact. The rabbit itself was harmless, but that fact was irrelevant to his nervous system. For Peter, the threat felt real. Jones was interested in a question that had enormous implications for psychology. If emotional responses can be learned, perhaps they can also be relearned. Not erased through force, not defeated through argument, but reshaped through experience. Her method was deceptively simple. Peter was seated in a high chair and given food he enjoyed, milk and crackers. While he ate, a white rabbit was placed at a distance far enough away that he remained calm. No pressure.
No confrontation.
No forced contact. Only coexistence. Pleasure and perceived threat occupying the same environment. This detail matters. Jones did not attempt to overpower fear with logic. She changed the conditions under which fear was being experienced. A nervous system cannot easily maintain full alarm while repeatedly encountering evidence of safety. At least not forever. The rabbit remained present. Peter remained safe. And the first invisible crack appeared in a pattern that once seemed stable. Not because someone convinced him the fear was irrational, but because his body was beginning to gather data his fear had never accounted for. The process was gradual, painfully gradual. Not because the method was weak, but because fear rarely surrenders all at once. The rabbit was moved closer in small increments across repeated sessions. A little closer, then closer again. Each adjustment was subtle enough to remain tolerable. This was the brilliance of the method. Too much intensity would have overwhelmed Peter and reinforced the fear. Too little contact would have changed nothing. The nervous system had to remain close enough to discomfort to learn, but not so flooded that learning became impossible. This is a narrow psychological corridor. Jones was effectively calibrating exposure before the term itself became standard. Peter continued eating while the rabbit slowly entered the territory his body once treated as dangerous. And something fascinating began to happen. The expected catastrophe never arrived.
No harm.
No attack.
No collapse. No unbearable consequence.
Only repetition. The same feared object. The same absence of disaster. Again and again. This matters more than most people realize. Fear often survives because prediction goes unchallenged. The body says, "This will end badly." Avoidance protects that prophecy from being tested. But when the feared situation is encountered repeatedly without the predicted catastrophe, the nervous system is forced into conflict. This model no longer matches reality. This mismatch creates pressure. And under enough repeated contradiction, the model begins to weaken. Not because courage suddenly appeared, because evidence accumulated. This is less romantic than most people imagine. Transformation is often not dramatic. It is statistical, a slow collapse of certainty built through repeated non-events. Eventually, the distance became almost meaningless. The object that had once triggered visible distress was now close enough for direct interaction. Peter was able to tolerate the rabbit, then touch it. This was not a theatrical breakthrough. No triumphant music.
No instant psychological reverse.
Just a child behaving differently in the presence of something his nervous system had previously classified as threatening. That subtle change is more radical than it appears, because what had shifted was not merely behavior. It was association. The rabbit had been rewritten, not in language, in physiology. His presence no longer automatically predicted distress. This is where many people misunderstand fear reduction. They imagine progress as emotional certainty, confidence, comfort, total absence of discomfort. But what changes first is often much less glamorous. Tolerance, a wider capacity to remain present without fleeing. The ability to stay in contact with what once activated alarm. This is the beginning of freedom, not because the world became safer, because the map inside the nervous system became more accurate. The threat estimate was corrected. Reality regained proportion. A harmless object stopped carrying emotional weight it never deserved. This principle reaches far beyond childhood phobias. The mind is constantly assigning meaning, upgrading predictions, downgrading threats, recalculating danger. And those calculations are often less fixed than they feel. What feels permanent can sometimes be surprisingly provisional, held together only by repetition and lack of contradiction. There is something almost offensive about how ordinary this solution appears. No secret ritual, no revelation from above, no hidden trait possessed only by unusually disciplined people. Just repeated contact under conditions the body can survive. This simplicity is difficult to accept, because it removes many comforting illusions. It means some fears persist not because they are too deep, too complex, or too meaningful to change, but because they are continuously protected from contradiction, maintained through distance, fed through absence, stabilized by never allowing reality to answer the prediction. This is psychologically expensive. Every avoided situation remains frozen in imagined danger, untested, untouched, allowed to retain mythological power. The feared object, person, place, or circumstance remains larger in the mind than it is in life. And over time, imagination begins governing behavior more than evidence. That is the architecture of unnecessary suffering, not pain itself. Anticipated pain protected from investigation. Mary Cover-Jones demonstrated something psychologically devastating in its implications. Fear can feel absolute while being surprisingly modifiable. Can feel like identity while being, in part, a revisable pattern. And if that is true, then many internal boundaries people organize their lives around may not be stable facts at all. Only rehearsed conclusions. But there is a darker layer beneath this realization. Changing a fear is one thing. Discovering what happens inside the brain while that change is occurring is something far more unsettling. The disturbing implication is not simply that fear can be learned or changed. It is that the machinery responsible for fear often activates before conscious thought has time to participate. Before language, before interpretation, before the internal narrator begins explaining what is happening. During the 1980s and 1990s, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux conducted a series of fear conditioning experiments that would radically alter how psychology understood threat detection. His research focused heavily on rats. Not because rats experience fear exactly as humans do, but because their neural systems offered a clearer map of how defensive responses are organized. The experimental logic was elegant. A neutral tone was repeatedly paired with a mild electric shock. First, the tone meant nothing. Then it became predictive. After enough pairings, the tone alone was enough to trigger defensive behavior. Freezing, heightened vigilance, physiological arousal. No shock required. Only anticipation. The body had learned. This part was not revolutionary by itself. What made Ledoux's work transformative was what happened when researchers traced the underlying neural pathways. The signal did not take a leisurely route through reflective cognition. It moved fast, extremely fast. Sensory information could reach the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deeply involved in emotional processing, through rapid subcortical pathways. This meant the brain could begin organizing a defensive response before higher cortical regions had fully interpreted what was being perceived. Reaction preceded explanation. The organism did not wait for certainty, prioritized speed over accuracy. This is not a flaw. It is architecture, an ancient design principle. Better to mobilize first and analyze later. But this creates a deeply human problem. Sometimes the body has already chosen fear before the mind even knows what case it is trying to defend. This explains a psychological experience almost everyone has encountered. The sudden jolt in the body before understanding. A loud sound and the shoulders tense. A movement in peripheral vision and the heart accelerates. A message notification appears from a particular person and the stomach tightens before the content is even read. The body reacts first. Meaning is often assigned afterward. This is not irrationality in the simplistic sense people often imagine. It is sequencing. Ledoux's work suggested that threat detection is layered. There are slower routes involving more detailed cortical processing, where information is evaluated with greater nuance. But there is also a faster route. Cruder, less precise, more urgent. This rapid channel is optimized not for philosophical truth, but for survival under uncertainty. This job is not to be elegant. This job is to be useful. And usefulness in dangerous environments often means tolerating false alarms. A nervous system that occasionally panics unnecessarily is cheaper, biologically speaking, than one that misses a genuine threat. This is why fear can feel embarrassingly disproportionate. You know something is probably safe, and still your body behaves as though danger is already present. The discrepancy can feel humiliating, as if knowledge should automatically control physiology. But information alone does not instantly rewrite ancient defensive architecture. The organism is not built like a courtroom. Evidence is not calmly reviewed and then translated into bodily action. It is built like an emergency system.
Rapid detección. Rapid mobilization.
Explanation later. This is why so many people misinterpret their own reactions. They assume intensity equals accuracy. If I feel this strongly, something must be wrong. But intensity is not always intelligence. Sometimes it is simply speed without context. There is a brutal efficiency to this design. Conscious awareness is slow. Deliberation is expensive. In moments of possible danger, hesitation can be fatal. So evolution built systems that privilege readiness over reflection. The cost is obvious. A mechanism optimized for speed is vulnerable to distortion, can overfire, misclassify, generalize, react to signals that resemble threat without confirming whether threat is truly present. Ledoux's experiments helped formalize something many people experience but struggle to articulate. You do not always choose the first wave. The surge of activation, the tension, the acceleration, the involuntary narrowing of attention. These processes often unfold automatically. By the time consciousness catches up, the body may already be deep into a defensive state. This is psychologically disorienting. A person believes they are making decisions in real time. Often they are partially interpreting states that have already begun. This is why fear can feel like fate. Not because it is uncontrollable forever, but because its opening move is often made outside deliberate awareness. The mind arrives late to a game already in motion. Then it starts constructing explanations, stories, justifications, reasons why the fear must make sense. This is one of the most underappreciated features of human cognition. The narrative frequently comes after the reaction, not before it. And once a convincing explanation attaches itself to an activated body, the experience feels coherent, logical, even inevitable. But coherence can be misleading. A story can feel persuasive while merely explaining a response whose origin was far more primitive than the explanation itself. This changes the way fear must be understood, not as a moral weakness, not as evidence of character failure, not even always as a conscious choice, but as a layered biological event. A fast system issuing preliminary judgments under uncertainty. A slower system arriving later trying to make sense of the consequences. This distinction is subtle, but it is psychologically liberating, because it means the first alarm is not necessarily a verdict. Not every surge of fear is an instruction. Not every bodily warning deserves obedience. A pounding heart does not automatically indicate danger. A tightening chest does not certify catastrophe. An activated nervous system is often reporting prediction, not reality. This is an uncomfortable truth, People are deeply tempted to trust what feels immediate, what feels urgent, what feels intense. But subjective intensity can be a poor map of objective threat. Ledoux's research exposed a system built to prioritize survival, not emotional comfort. And that means your body may sincerely attempt to protect you from dangers that exist only as fast approximations. Crude estimates, incomplete calculations, protective guesses. The body is not lying, but it is not always right. That difference matters, because the moment you understand that fear can be genuine without being accurate, a dangerous possibility opens. If the first alarm is not the final truth, then much of what feels unquestionably threatening may deserve closer inspection. And what happens when that alarm is repeatedly obeyed instead of questioned leads somewhere far more costly than most people ever realize. The most dangerous part of fear is not always the fear itself. It is the relief that follows escape. That relief feels innocent, rational even. A difficult conversation is avoided, and tension drops. A message goes unanswered, and the tightness in the chest softens. A feared situation is postponed, and the nervous system exhales. The body interprets this shift as success. Problem solved. Threat neutralized. But this sensation can be profoundly misleading. In 1947, psychologist O. Hobart Maurer proposed what became known as the two-factor theory of avoidance learning. It was an attempt to explain something behaviorists had observed repeatedly in both animals and humans. Fear is acquired through classical conditioning, but avoidance is maintained through something else. Operant conditioning. This distinction matters. The first process explains how something becomes frightening. The second explains why the fear persists, and often intensifies. Maurer demonstrated that once an organism learns to associate a stimulus with threat, escaping or avoiding that stimulus produces a reduction in distress. That reduction is rewarding, not because something pleasurable was added, but because something unpleasant was removed. This is called negative reinforcement. The behavior that produced relief becomes more likely to occur again. Not due to wisdom, not due to truth, due to consequence. Avoidance works in the short term. That is precisely the problem. If avoidance felt terrible, it would not become habitual. But it feels effective, elegant, protective. Perfect loop is formed. Fear motivates escape. Escape produces relief. Relief strengthens escape. And what feels like self-protection begins quietly training dependence on avoidance. This is where fear becomes self-sustaining. Not because danger is growing, because the strategy used to reduce fear is secretly preserving it. This mechanism is brutally efficient because it teaches through sensation. No philosophy required. No conscious agreement necessary. The organism does not need to understand the process. It only needs to experience the sequence. Alarm, escape, relief, repeat. This is enough. The nervous system is not asking whether the avoided situation was objectively dangerous. It is recording what followed behavior. Did distress decrease after leaving? Yes. Then leaving is reinforced. This logic can become astonishingly powerful. A person avoids public speaking once and feels immediate relief. The next time, avoidance becomes slightly easier, then easier again. The temporary relief is interpreted as evidence that escape was correct. A dangerous illusion emerges. Avoidance starts feeling not just preferable, but necessary. The individual no longer experiences escape as a choice. It begins to feel like survival. This is how optional behaviors harden into psychological rules. Not because someone consciously designed them, because reinforcement is indifferent to accuracy. It strengthens what reduces discomfort, not what increases freedom. This distinction is devastating. Many behaviors people describe as personality are simply reinforced adaptations. I hate confrontation. I'm not social. I work better alone. I don't do uncertainty well. Sometimes these statements describe preference. Sometimes they describe learning histories built on repeated relief. Avoidance can disguise itself as identity with extraordinary effectiveness, because every retreat feels temporarily justified, validated by immediate calm. The prison does not announce itself. It rewards construction one act at a time. And because each act reduces discomfort, the structure feels less like confinement and more like intelligent self-management. The cruelty of this loop is subtle. Nothing dramatic is required. A life can become increasingly restricted through small acts no outsider would notice. A declined invitation, a delayed decision, a conversation postponed, a risk quietly abandoned. Each moment seems trivial in isolation, reasonable, defensible, but behavior compounds, and the nervous system is always watching, always learning. Every avoided experience becomes missing data, an unanswered question. What would actually have happened? That answer is never collected, so the original fear remains uncontested, protected, preserved in ambiguity. This is why avoidance can make fear feel increasingly convincing over time. Not because new evidence confirms danger, because no evidence is allowed to compete with the prediction. The feared scenario remains frozen in imagination, where it is free to grow unchecked. Memory adds distortion. Anticipation adds catastrophe. Time adds mythology. Soon, what was once mildly uncomfortable begins to feel enormous, almost sacred in its untouchability. Mohrer's framework revealed something deeply unsettling about human suffering. Relief is not always a sign you made a wise decision. Sometimes relief is the reward system paying you to remain psychologically unchanged. This is a difficult truth to accept, because it means calm can be deceptive. A reduction in anxiety does not automatically equal progress. Sometimes it signals retreat, and repeated retreat can quietly organize an entire life around shrinking exposure to uncertainty, challenge, and growth. This is why fear can become so persuasive. It does not merely threaten discomfort. It offers an alternative, immediate relief, a softer heartbeat, quieter mind, a temporary return to internal order. That offer is difficult to refuse, especially when the cost is hidden. Avoidance rarely presents its invoice up front. Charges later, in opportunities not taken, skills never developed, conversations never had, identities never tested. The person often believes they are preserving stability. In reality, they may be preserving fragility. A system protected from discomfort is never forced to recalibrate. Its predictions remain old. Its alarms remain sensitive. This world remains narrow. This is the paradox at the center of avoidance. The act designed to reduce suffering can become one of its most reliable producers. Not instantly, gradually, quietly, with impeccable logic. Every retreat makes emotional sense in the moment. That is why the trap is so convincing. Mohrer's theory did not reveal a dramatic villain hidden inside the human mind. It revealed something more unsettling. A learning system that can sincerely reward behaviors that deepen long-term suffering. Not out of malice, out of efficiency. And once that mechanism is understood, a more uncomfortable question emerges. If escaping fear strengthens it, then what exactly must happen for the system to finally begin weakening instead? If avoidance secretly feeds fear, then the logic becomes brutal. Relief must be interrupted. The loop has to be broken at the exact point where the nervous system expects rescue. This is psychologically violent in a very specific way. Not because physical harm is involved, but because the individual is asked to remain in direct contact with what feels intolerable while refusing the behavior that normally restores safety. During the 1980s and 1990s, psychologist Edna Foa became one of the central researchers developing and refining exposure and response prevention, often known as ERP, particularly for individuals suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder. The structure was simple in description and excruciating in practice. A patient would deliberately encounter a feared trigger. Then they would be prevented from performing the ritual or compulsion normally used to reduce anxiety. A person afraid of contamination might touch something perceived as dirty, and then not wash. A person consumed by checking rituals might leave without rechecking locks or appliances, and then not return. This is where the experience becomes psychologically unbearable. The compulsion is not random behavior. It is a safety strategy, a ritual designed to neutralize catastrophe, prevent harm, reduce uncertainty, restore control. Removing it feels reckless, almost immoral. The patient often experiences a spike in anxiety so intense it appears to confirm their worst assumptions. This was the critical moment, not the trigger itself, not even the fear, but the refusal to perform rescue. Because the nervous system was about to encounter something it had been systematically protected from learning. What happens when the expected catastrophe is not prevented and still never arrives? The first wave is often chaos. The body revolts, heart rate rises, muscles tense, thoughts accelerate. Catastrophic scenarios flood consciousness with astonishing credibility. This is why compulsions feel so necessary. They are not habits in the ordinary sense. They are emergency procedures. The mind treats them as if something terrible depends on their completion. Wash or contamination will spread. Check or disaster will occur. Count, arrange, repeat, neutralize. The ritual becomes psychologically fused with survival. This fusion is powerful because the person rarely gets to observe what happens without the ritual. The sequence is interrupted too early. Anxiety appears. Compulsion follows. Relief arrives. The system never collects missing data. ERP changes that. The patient remains.
No washing, no checking, no neutralizing.
No escape through ritual. And then something deeply counterintuitive begins to unfold. The anxiety rises, sometimes sharply, sometimes to levels that feel almost intolerable. But then, without the ritual, something remarkable happens. It begins to fall, not because the person solved the threat, not because control was restored, not because certainty was achieved. It declines on its own. This process is known as habituation. The nervous system, deprived of its usual escape mechanism, slowly recalibrates. The feared prediction remains active long enough to be tested, and reality refuses to cooperate with catastrophe.
No contamination apocalypse. No immediate disaster.
No collapse proportional to the fear. Only time passing. The feared consequence absent. Again, the body is forced into contradiction. Its alarm had predicted necessity. Reality delivered something else entirely. This is where something fundamental changes. Not because the person suddenly feels fearless. Often they do not. Not immediately. What changes first is trust in the ritual. Its authority weakens. The compulsion had promised protection. But the patient has now witnessed a destabilizing fact. The feared event did not require ritual prevention in order not to happen. That realization is psychologically explosive, because it attacks the hidden contract maintaining the behavior. The ritual says, without me, something bad will happen. ERP creates the conditions to test that claim directly. And repeated enough times, the contract begins to collapse. Not through argument, through disconfirmation. This is one of the most important lessons in fear treatment. The nervous system is not fully persuaded by reassurance. It is persuaded by violated expectations. Prediction says catastrophe. Reality says otherwise. Repeat this contradiction often enough, and the emotional architecture begins to shift. This is not comfort. It is revision, a rewriting of probabilities inside the body. The feared trigger remains externally unchanged. A doorknob is still a doorknob. An unchecked lock is still unchecked. But internally, the threat estimate begins losing credibility. This is the beginning of a quieter nervous system, not because the world became controllable, but because the person discovered they had been outsourcing safety to rituals that never possessed the power they were assigned. That realization is both freeing and deeply unsettling, because it raises a more uncomfortable possibility. How many other internal rituals, visible or invisible, are being obeyed under the illusion that they are necessary for survival? Edna Foa's work revealed something psychologically profound. Anxiety is often treated as if it were an intolerable force requiring immediate management. Something dangerous in itself. Something that must be reduced, neutralized, controlled. But anxiety is frequently more survivable than the behaviors built to escape it would suggest. This is the contradiction at the center of the system. The person believes they cannot tolerate uncertainty. Then they do. They believe they cannot survive unneutralized risk. Then they survive. They believe catastrophe is being actively prevented by ritual. Then the ritual is removed, and reality remains intact. Each repetition weakens an old assumption. Not gently, almost offensively, the body begins learning a truth the mind may have resisted for years. Discomfort is not destruction. A spike in anxiety is not proof of danger. Urgency is not always instruction. This is a radical correction, because much of fear depends on confusing internal activation with external reality. ERP exposes that confusion mercilessly. It removes the illusion of necessity, and in doing so, it reveals something even more destabilizing than fear itself. How much of human suffering is maintained not by external threat, but by repeated attempts to feel safe too quickly. That is the darker implication. Sometimes the behaviors people trust most are the very mechanisms preventing recalibration. And what happens when behavior alone begins changing the structure of the brain is where this becomes even harder to ignore. There is a seductive misunderstanding many people carry about change. They imagine behavior is superficial, something cosmetic, a thin layer placed over something deeper and more real. Thoughts are considered important. Beliefs are considered profound. But actions are often treated as secondary, as performance, as theater. This assumption begins to fracture when the brain itself becomes visible. In 1996, Jeffrey Schwartz and colleagues published a study examining patients with obsessive-compulsive disorder undergoing cognitive behavioral treatment that included exposure-based interventions. This was not merely a report of symptom improvement. It was an attempt to observe whether repeated behavioral change could be linked to measurable changes in brain function. Using positron emission tomography or PET scans, researchers measured metabolic activity in brain regions implicated in OCD, particularly the caudate nucleus and orbitofrontal circuitry, areas associated with repetitive thoughts, compulsive urges, and maladaptive behavioral loops. Before treatment, these systems showed abnormal patterns of heightened activity. The machinery appeared locked into overactivation, as if certain circuits had become chronically overengaged. This was psychologically important, because it gave visible form to what sufferers already experienced internally. Not weakness, not laziness, not lack of discipline, a system caught in repetition. But the more unsettling question remained unanswered. Could repeated changes in behavior alter those visible patterns? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, biologically. Could refusing old rituals, tolerating uncertainty, and repeatedly engaging in corrective behavior do more than change experience? Could behavior itself begin reorganizing the physical functioning of the brain? The answer was deeply consequential. After undergoing treatment, patients were scanned again. Not after a philosophical revelation, not after medication alone, after repeated behavioral work, repeated exposure, repeated resistance to compulsions, repeated contact with uncertainty, repeated refusal to obey old threat management systems. The scans showed measurable changes. Activity patterns in implicated brain regions shifted. The previously hyperactive circuitry no longer displayed the same level of dysregulation. Something had changed, not just subjectively, objectively. This finding was profound because it collapsed a false distinction many people maintain. Mind on one side, brain on the other, as though behavior lives in a psychological realm disconnected from biology. Schwartz's study made that separation harder to defend. Repeated actions were not merely expressing a mind. They were helping reshape the machinery through which mental states were being generated. This is neuroplasticity stripped of abstraction. Not an inspirational slogan, not a vague promise, a biological system altering through patterned experience. The implications are uncomfortable because they challenge a deeply convenient fantasy that one can think their way into transformation while behavior remains mostly unchanged. But brains are not persuaded by intention alone. They are sculpted by repetition. What is practiced becomes prioritized. What is repeated becomes easier. What is avoided remains unresolved. The nervous system tracks evidence through experience. not through aspiration. This means every repeated act is participating in construction, whether consciously or not. Every ritual reinforces architecture. Every exposure revises it. Behavior is not a symptom floating above the system. It is one of the tools through which the system is continually being built. This reframes discipline in a far less romantic way, not as moral superiority, not as proof of extraordinary will, but as repeated behavioral input delivered into a system capable of adaptation. Every action is information, not in a poetic sense, in a regulatory sense. The brain is constantly updating based on what is repeatedly encountered, repeatedly avoided, repeatedly endured, repeatedly escaped. A person who repeatedly withdraws from discomfort is not simply making isolated decisions. They are teaching the system something. A person who repeatedly remains present in the face of uncertainty is also teaching the system something. Different curriculum, different architecture, same principle. This is what makes behavioral change so deceptively powerful. It rarely feels dramatic while occurring.
No cinematic transformation. No audible shift.
Just repetition. Small, often unpleasant repetitions. Yet beneath subjective boredom, recalibration is underway. Schwartz and colleagues gave scientific visibility to this hidden process. A person engaging in exposure-based treatment was not merely coping better. Their brain function was measurably shifting. The old circuitry was losing dominance. Alternative patterns were gaining traction. This matters because many people wait for internal readiness before changing behavior. They want evidence that the mind has already transformed. But often the sequence is reversed. Behavior begins first. Internal reorganization follows. Not instantly, not painlessly, but observably. The body and brain are less interested in promises than in patterns. What you repeatedly do becomes part of what the system expects from reality. And expectation is one of the deepest architects of emotional life. There is something both empowering and unsettling in this discovery. Empowering because it means change is more concrete than many people assume. Less mystical, less dependent on sudden emotional clarity, less reliant on waiting to become a different person, but unsettling for the same reason, because every repeated pattern is leaving traces, even when ignored, even when rationalized, even when disguised as harmless habit. The brain does not remain neutral while life is being lived. It is always adapting, always allocating efficiency, always converting repetition into preference, prediction, and bias. This means there is no behavioral vacuum, no pause button,
No harmless rehearsal.
What is repeated is being installed, slowly, quietly, often beneath awareness. Schwartz's study did not simply show that treatment can help. It exposed a harder truth. You are always training something. The only question is what? A calmer system, or a more reactive one? Greater flexibility, or deeper rigidity? Expanded tolerance, or increasingly narrow thresholds for discomfort? This is the hidden seriousness of ordinary behavior. Not because every act is dramatic, but because accumulation is. And once this becomes clear, a more unsettling issue appears. If repeated experience can reshape the brain itself, then what happens when fear is not only endured in controlled conditions, but confronted voluntarily in the chaos of real life? There is a point where fear stops being theoretical. It becomes procedural, not something you think about, something you execute under pressure. NASA understands this with brutal clarity. Long before astronauts ever leave Earth, they are placed inside environments designed to simulate failure. Not comfort, not confidence, failure. Training programs across NASA history have relied heavily on repeated emergency simulations. From spacecraft malfunctions to sudden loss of communication, from oxygen constraints to navigation breakdowns, crews are repeatedly exposed to scenarios where the system appears to be collapsing. The purpose is not spectacle. It is desensitization through structured repetition. At first, these simulations trigger intense stress responses. The body reacts as if the event is real. Heart rate spikes, attention narrows, cognitive load increases sharply. Even highly trained individuals experience the physiological signature of threat, because the brain does not immediately distinguish between simulation and reality when stakes feel plausible. But something changes over time. The same scenario, repeated under controlled conditions, begins to lose its emotional shock. Not because it becomes less important, but because it becomes familiar. The unknown becomes mapped. The chaotic becomes procedural. What once triggered panic begins to trigger recognition. This shift is subtle but decisive, because in space, there is no room for improvising emotional regulation. There is only what has already been rehearsed. NASA's philosophy is not to eliminate fear. It is to pre-experience it until it no longer breaks cognition, until the body can remain functional inside conditions that would normally overwhelm it. This is not comfort training. It is survival conditioning, and it reveals something unsettling about fear itself. It is not always the intensity of danger that disables action. It is unfamiliarity. Inside these simulations, repetition becomes a form of psychological engineering. Each scenario is carefully designed to activate stress responses without causing real-world harm. The environment is controlled, but the experience is not emotionally neutral. It is intentionally destabilizing. This controlled instability is the key, because the nervous system is being taught something under conditions that feel real enough to matter, but safe enough to survive. At first, participants may experience cognitive overload. Decision-making slows, attention fragments. There is a natural tendency to revert to instinctive reactions rather than structured procedure. This is where training begins to matter most, because instinct alone is not sufficient in complex systems under failure conditions. Procedure must override panic, and procedure only becomes dominant through repetition under pressure. NASA training does not assume calmness will appear spontaneously in crisis. It assumes the opposite, that panic is the default under uncertainty. So the goal is not suppression of panic. It is procedural replacement of panic responses. Repeated exposure allows the brain to encode steps that function even when emotional systems are activated. Checklist execution becomes more reliable than fear response. Communication protocols become more accessible than emotional interpretation. Over time, something remarkable happens. The same stressors that once disrupted performance begin to coexist with functional behavior. Stress remains present, but it no longer dictates action. This is not emotional elimination. It is hierarchical restructuring. Fear still activates, but it loses authority over decision-making. And that shift only occurs because the system has been repeatedly exposed to conditions that previously felt uncontrollable. The deeper implication of this kind of training is not confidence. It is reliability under distortion, a system that remains operational when perception is compromised, when urgency is high, when uncertainty is extreme, when emotional signals are loud enough to interfere with interpretation. NASA does not train astronauts to feel safe. It trains them to function without needing safety to be felt. This distinction is crucial, because it separates emotional experience from operational capacity. In normal life, these are often fused. People assume that feeling afraid means inability to act clearly, but simulation training repeatedly breaks that assumption. Action can persist even when fear is fully present. This does not require fearlessness. It requires repetition under guided exposure. Each simulation adds another layer of familiarity to previously unstructured threat scenarios. The brain begins to anticipate structure inside chaos, and anticipation reduces cognitive fragmentation. What once felt like overwhelming uncertainty becomes a sequence of recognizable steps, not because the environment has changed, but because the internal model has been refined. This is how survival systems are built for extreme environments, not by removing threat, but by repeatedly entering controlled versions of it until response patterns stabilize. The lesson extends beyond space. Any system that demands performance under pressure relies on the same principle. Repeated exposure transforms unpredictable stress into executable process. And once this transformation occurs, something paradoxical becomes visible. The situations that once triggered the strongest fear responses are no longer the ones that control behavior. But the question that follows is more unsettling. If controlled exposure can reorganize response in simulated danger, what happens when exposure is no longer controlled at all, and the nervous system is left to adapt in real conditions without structure? Inside NASA training facilities, fear is not treated as an enemy. It is treated as a condition that must be rehearsed until it stops interrupting action. Astronauts do not wait for calm before exposure. They enter simulations designed to replicate failure under pressure. Emergency scenarios are constructed with precision. System malfunctions, communication loss, oxygen constraints, navigation failures. The goal is not surprise. The goal is controlled repetition of the unpredictable. At first, the body reacts exactly as it would in real danger. Heart rate increases. Attention narrows. Cognitive processing becomes fragmented under stress. Even knowing it is training does not fully prevent the physiological response, because the nervous system responds to perceived threat patterns, not labels. But repetition changes the relationship. The same scenario, experienced again and again, begins to lose its emotional shock. Not because it becomes safe, but because it becomes familiar. The unfamiliar becomes structured. Chaos becomes procedural. What once triggered panic begins to trigger recognition of steps, protocols, and sequence. NASA does not assume that fear will disappear in real missions. It assumes fear will appear instantly. So training is designed to ensure that action does not depend on emotional stability. Instead, it depends on rehearsed behavior that can run even when stress is active. This is where transformation happens, not in eliminating fear, but in building response pathways that remain functional inside it. What makes this type of training powerful is not intensity alone. It is repetition under realistic constraint. Each simulation is designed to force decision-making under conditions that resemble operational reality. Not perfect copies of danger, but structured approximations of it. This matters because the brain does not require perfect realism to activate threat systems. It only requires plausible patterns. Once activated, those systems can overwhelm reasoning unless alternative pathways have been trained into stability. In NASA simulations, astronauts learn to rely on procedures rather than internal emotional state. Checklists replace hesitation. Communication protocols replace confusion. Sequential action replaces panic-driven improvisation. At first, this feels unnatural. The mind wants to interpret, to predict outcomes, to resolve uncertainty emotionally, but repeated exposure shifts the dominant strategy. Action becomes faster than interpretation. Execution becomes more reliable than emotional regulation. The system learns that waiting for fear to disappear is not a viable strategy in high-risk environments. So fear remains present, but it loses operational authority. This distinction is crucial because it reveals that performance under stress is not about absence of internal disturbance. It is about whether disturbance can interrupt function. NASA training systematically reduces that vulnerability, not by suppressing fear, but by building procedural dominance over it. Over time, repetition produces something counterintuitive. The brain begins to anticipate structure inside chaos. This anticipation reduces fragmentation during stress exposure. What once felt like overwhelming uncertainty becomes a sequence that can be navigated. Not because the environment becomes easier, but because internal mapping becomes more detailed. Each repetition adds clarity to previously unstructured threat patterns. And that clarity is what reduces panic. Not reassurance, not optimism, structural familiarity. NASA training is not about convincing astronauts that emergencies will be safe. It is about ensuring that emergencies will be legible, readable enough to act within them, even when fear signals are active, even when the body is responding as if survival is at risk. This creates a separation between emotional intensity and functional capacity. A trained astronaut can experience high physiological stress while still performing required actions. This is not suppression. It is parallel processing under load. Fear runs. procedure runs, and procedure is trained to stay dominant. The most important shift is that uncertainty is no longer treated as a signal to stop. It becomes a condition to operate inside. And once that threshold is crossed, behavior is no longer dependent on emotional permission. The deepest contradiction in survival training is this. It does not remove fear. It removes its exclusivity. Fear stops being the only interpretation available to the nervous system. And once that happens, behavior is no longer dictated by a single internal voice. It becomes a selection process under pressure. This is why astronauts are trained repeatedly, not occasionally. Because a single exposure does not rewrite dominance. It only introduces an alternative. Repetition is what stabilizes it. But even then, nothing is permanent. Under extreme novelty, under unexpected failure modes, under conditions that were never rehearsed, older responses can reappear. Not because training failed, but because prediction systems always default to what is most strongly encoded when uncertainty exceeds mapped experience. This is the core vulnerability of all learned safety. It is conditional on context matching, which means even the most trained system remains a negotiation between learned procedure and inherited alarm. And that negotiation never fully ends. Because the brain never stops trying to predict what comes next. Not even in the moments where it appears completely calm. There is a final misconception that everything up to this point quietly dismantles. The idea that fear must disappear in order for a person to be free. This belief feels intuitive, almost obvious. If something is frightening, then relief should mean its removal. But modern exposure research suggests something more precise and far less comforting. Fear does not vanish cleanly. It is not deleted like a file. It remains encoded. In 2014, Michel Krask and colleagues articulated and advanced what is known as the inhibitory learning model of exposure therapy. This framework reframed decades of clinical observation. The goal of exposure is not erasure. It is competition. Old fear associations are not wiped out. They are challenged by newly formed safety learning. The brain holds multiple predictions at the same time. One says, "This is dangerous." Another says, "This is safe." And neither fully deletes the other. They coexist, compete, weaken or strengthen depending on which is reinforced by experience. This is a crucial shift in understanding, because it means recovery is not about removing fear memories. It is about building stronger, more accessible alternative predictions. During exposure, a person does not convince the brain that the original fear was false. Instead, they create repeated experiences where the feared outcome does not occur. And the brain is forced to encode a new statistical reality. The alarm still exists, but it is no longer the only voice in the system. It becomes one signal among others, not erased, recontextualized. This explains why fear can return even after successful change. Not as failure, but as retrieval. The old pathway was never destroyed. It remains stored, latent, waiting for conditions that resemble its original learning context. A smell, place, a sensation, a thought pattern, and suddenly the alarm reactivates. This is often misinterpreted as relapse, as if progress was undone. But within the inhibitory learning model, this is expected. Memory is not a single switch that flips off permanently. It is a network of competing associations. What determines experience is not which memory exists, but which one dominates in a given moment. Krask's work emphasized that exposure must therefore focus not only on reducing fear during the session, but on strengthening the learning that competes with it. Variability matters. Violation of expectation matters. The brain learns most strongly when predicted danger fails to occur in meaningful, sometimes unpredictable ways. This creates a more flexible safety memory, one that is less dependent on exact repetition of context. So when fear returns, it does not return unchallenged. There is something already there, a counterweight, a learned contradiction. This is why exposure is not about convincing yourself you are safe once. It is about accumulating evidence across time that safety can exist even when fear predictions activate. The nervous system slowly updates its probabilities. not to zero fear, but to reduced authority of fear. The implication is subtle but profound. Freedom is not the absence of activation. It is the presence of alternative interpretation. A nervous system that can generate more than one prediction about the same experience is no longer locked into a single narrative of threat. It becomes negotiable. This is the core shift introduced by inhibitory learning. Not fear elimination, fear flexibility. And flexibility changes everything about how fear behaves in real life. Because rigid fear systems demand avoidance. They collapse uncertainty into urgency. They force action toward escape. But a system with competing predictions can pause inside activation. It can tolerate ambiguity without, when viewed together, everything converges on a single unsettling idea. Fear is not a switch to be turned off. It is a prediction system that learns through contradiction. And contradiction requires exposure to reality that refuses to match expectation. Not once, repeatedly. The brain updates not because it is told to change, but because it cannot consistently justify its older predictions against incoming evidence. Even then, the old fear does not disappear. It remains as a possibility, a stored hypothesis, but it loses its monopoly. This is the hidden architecture behind all the mechanisms seen across decades of research. Conditioning, extinction, exposure, RP, neuroplastic change, simulation training, inhibitory learning. Different names describing the same principle from different angles. Fear is recalibrated, not erased. And recalibration depends on experience that repeatedly violates expectation while the system remains engaged. This is why avoidance preserves fear, why relief strengthens it, why exposure weakens its authority, and why the brain itself visibly changes when behavior changes long enough. But there is an uncomfortable tension left unresolved. If fear never fully disappears, only loses dominance, then what determines when it suddenly returns with full intensity in real life, even after extensive recalibration? There is a moment the nervous system recognizes before the mind is willing to admit it. When prediction stops feeling like prediction and starts feeling like certainty again. This is where most explanations about fear collapse, because they assume progress is linear, that once the brain has learned safety, it stays there. But the architecture underneath does not work that way. Competing memories do not disappear. They negotiate dominance based on context, load, and signal strength, which means stability is always conditional, never absolute. There are moments when the system reverts not because it is failing, but because it is doing exactly what it was designed to do: prioritize threat detection when uncertainty spikes beyond its learned tolerance. And the unsettling part is this. The same brain that learned safety through repetition can re-enter threat mode through a single pattern match that feels close enough to old danger. Not identical, just similar enough to trigger the cascade. This is why experience does not create immunity. It creates probability shifts. And probability can be overridden when context compresses too fast for updated learning to surface. So what looks like regression is often reactivation. The older system does not die. It waits. And it is always listening for cues that justify its return. Which means every moment of calm is not proof of final resolution. It is a temporary dominance of one interpretation over another, held in place by current evidence, not permanent truth. The brain does not archive experience as history. It updates it as prediction, which means memory is not a record of what happened. It is a model of what is likely to happen again. And models are always vulnerable to revision. This is where the illusion of safety becomes fragile, because safety is not stored as a final state. It is stored as a pattern that must continuously prove itself against incoming data. The moment new data contradicts it with enough intensity, the system reevaluates everything it thought it had learned. Not emotionally, statistically, and that recalculation can feel like collapse from the inside. Even when it is simply recalibration, what creates suffering is not the existence of fear. It is the demand that fear should never return once understood. But nothing in the nervous system supports that guarantee. Instead, it operates through layered probabilities competing in real time. One system predicts danger, Another predicts safety, and behavior emerges from whichever signal is strongest in that moment. This means the experience of being free from fear is always misinterpreted. It is not absence. It is dominance of a competing prediction strong enough to suppress older signals temporarily, which also explains why fear feels so absolute when it returns, because it does not arrive as a memory. It arrives as a current prediction of reality, and the body obeys prediction faster than interpretation. There is a point where the language of control stops being useful, because nothing here is fully controlled, only influenced, tilted, shaped by repetition, context, and exposure that never guarantees permanence. This is why fear work is not about conquest. It is about relationship under instability, the capacity to remain inside a system that can change its interpretation of danger without warning and still not collapse into automatic escape. That capacity is not built by insight. It is built by accumulated experience where prediction fails and survival continues anyway, over and over again, until the nervous system stops treating uncertainty as synonymous with catastrophe. But even then, something remains unresolved, because the system never stops being a prediction engine. It never stops scanning, never stops updating, never stops preparing for threat even in moments of calm. So what changes is not the machinery. It is the weight given to its signals, and that weight can shift back under the right conditions, which leads to a final contradiction. The more a mind learns how fear works, the more it realizes that understanding does not place it outside of fear. It only makes its patterns more visible while still inside them, and visibility does not equal escape. What remains, after all the mechanisms are named and all the systems are understood, is not mastery. It is exposure to the fact that the mind never becomes a place without prediction. It only becomes a place where predictions are no longer singular, where more than one version of reality can exist at once, and neither can fully erase the other. And in that tension, life is actually decided, not in certainty, but in the moment-to-moment selection of which signal is allowed to guide action. Fear is not removed from that equation. It is negotiated, again and again, and the negotiation never ends, because the system that produces fear is the same system that learns safety, which means the same architecture that tries to protect you is also the one that keeps reevaluating what protection means. There is no final state where interpretation stops, only shifting dominance between competing truths, and every attempt to reach permanent emotional silence misreads what the system was built to do in the first place. It was never designed to end fear. It was designed to survive by updating it. And once that is understood, the entire idea of being free from fear stops being a destination and becomes something far more precise and far less comforting: the ability to move forward while no single interpretation of reality ever fully disappears.